Evie Darnell's hands trembled as she slid the folded note into the Wolf King's hand, her heart hammering in her chest. "Don't drink it. Leave now." The grand hall of Blackthorn Castle shimmered in gold and crimson light, a stark contrast to the brewing storm that crackled in the air. Asher Blackthorn, the Wolf King, sat at the head of the long table, his piercing amber eyes scanning the room with cold indifference. His kingdom was vast, his rule absolute. Yet tonight, something felt wrong. The clinking of goblets, the soft laughter of lichens in silks and furs, the hum of music drifting from the corner. Nothing about the lavish banquet seemed out of place. But Evie knew better. The whispers of conspiracy, the subtle rustling of tension had reached her ears, and she couldn't ignore it. She moved through the crowd, the silver tray she carried trembling in her hands. The banquet was for the Wolf King's latest victory, a celebration of his reign over the lycanthrope kingdom. The entire court had gathered to honor him. Yet none of them knew what Evie had learned in the preparation chamber, nor could they hear the dark undertones behind the laughter. Asher was about to raise his glass in a toast. The poisoned goblet, the one marked with his personal seal, gleamed under the flickering chandeliers. Without hesitation, she slipped the note into his hand. Her fingers brushed against his as he gripped it, the sensation sending a jolt of something unspoken through her. She couldn't afford to wait for his reaction. Panic rising, she kept her gaze low, bowing slightly before retreating into the shadows of the room. Every moment was critical. Every heartbeat louder than the last. The king didn't notice her leave. His attention was fixed on the note. "Don't drink it. Leave now." Asher Blackthorn, immortal and untouchable, ruled the lycanthropes with fear. He was a king whose very presence commanded respect, and yet, beneath the cold exterior, something darker stirred. Tonight was meant to be a celebration, but even in the midst of this luxury, Asher could sense that his reign, built on years of dominance, bloodshed, and loyalty, was slipping. He had built his empire on the back of fear. But the people, his own court, had begun to look at him with less awe and more suspicion. Seated at the grand table, his black leather gloves rested on the polished surface, the weight of his rule pressing down on him. His amber eyes, glowing faintly in the low light, scanned the room as nobles raised their glasses in his honor, but his mind wasn't with them. His thoughts were interrupted when he felt a slight tug at his hand. A note, hidden amongst the clatter and noise of the court, was pressed into his palm. He froze. His gaze moved from the piece of parchment to the crowd. He didn't need to read the words to know that something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at him. Something, someone, was planning to end his reign tonight. Asher's eyes flickered to the goblet before him. The golden liquid shimmered, untouched, as if it were waiting to betray him. The court had already begun to murmur, the polite laughter turning to hushed whispers as they noticed the shift in his demeanor. His hand tightened around the note, his mind racing. The message was clear. Don't drink it. But who would dare to poison him in his own castle? Before he could take further action, the moment passed. The noble in front of him raised his glass, smiling and oblivious. Asher set his goblet down, watching the banquet with a sense of growing unease. A decision had to be made. He couldn't remain in the hall and ignore the threat. The poison, the conspiracy. It was too calculated, too deliberate to be dismissed as a mere act of paranoia. Evie Darnell had saved his life. But why? What was her involvement in this web of deceit? Why had she, a lowly servant, chosen to risk everything for him? The room seemed to close in on him, and for the first time in centuries, the Wolf King felt the sharp sting of vulnerability. Lucian Blackthorn had spent centuries building his empire, but his reign was at a crossroads. Even in the midst of his power, he couldn't deny the unraveling threads that had begun to tear at the fabric of his kingdom. A life lived in shadows, a rule forged in blood and fear. Was it truly worth it? As the court continued its celebration, Asher's thoughts turned inward. Who had tried to kill him, and what role had the mortal servant, Evie Darnell, played in this growing conspiracy? His mind spun with the possibilities. The night was far from over, and Asher knew that it would take more than just strength to survive. He needed answers, and he needed them before it was too late. The answers lay with Evie. But first, he had to survive the night. Asher Blackthorn stood at the head of the table, his amber eyes scanning the sea of faces, his hand still gripping the delicate goblet of wine that had been placed before him. His pulse thudded loudly in his ears, a quiet rhythm that matched the growing tension in the air. The grand banquet hall, once a place of jubilant celebration, now felt suffocating, its grandeur suddenly tainted by a dangerous uncertainty. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, transforming the crystal goblets and gleaming silverware into menacing shapes that seemed to leer back at him. His guests, oblivious to the danger, continued their polite conversations, their laughter mingling with the low hum of music from the orchestra at the far end of the hall. Everything appeared normal, too perfect, but not for Asher. He could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere. The sudden weight that pressed down on him, suffocating his thoughts. His hand, steady as it had always been, tightened around the stem of the goblet, the red liquid swirling as if it, too, knew what was coming. The note in his hand, the one Evie Darnell had slipped to him moments ago, burned against his skin like a warning. "Don't drink it. Leave now." He had seen the urgency in her eyes, the terror that flashed across her face before she disappeared into the shadows. Evie, a mere servant, had risked everything to deliver that note. And now, he had to act. But the king within him, a ruler who had commanded armies, who had struck fear into his enemies, had learned one lesson over the centuries: patience. He couldn't tip his hand too soon. Not here. Not now. He raised the goblet to his lips, pretending to follow the ceremony. The nobles around him, their eyes glinting with admiration and respect, awaited the toast, their eager faces gleaming under the golden glow of the chandeliers. Asher, however, didn't taste the wine. He was already calculating his next move, his mind running through possibilities, desperately seeking the source of the threat. His gaze flicked from one figure to the next, studying each face for any sign of malice. Was it Lord Corwin? No, the traitor had never been subtle enough to act alone. Perhaps one of the others, the ones who had always smiled a little too broadly in his presence, their loyalty veiled behind flattering words. Or maybe it was someone closer, someone with access to the very heart of his court. His lips hovered just above the goblet's rim, his mind teetering between the need for survival and the image of the king that he had to project. He had survived worse, betrayals, bloodshed, wars fought on his command, but never had his own life been threatened in such a subtle, quiet way. Poison, a threat laced in liquid form, its danger invisible to the naked eye. Asher's eyes narrowed, searching the crowd again. His stomach twisted as he glanced at the nearest servant, a young man carrying a tray of wine. The wine. He didn't know if he could trust it anymore. The goblet felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it should have been. He took another deliberate moment to study his surroundings, looking for any movement, any flicker of nervousness among his courtiers. His gaze briefly caught the eyes of his most trusted general, Captain Merrick, who gave him a subtle nod, probably an attempt to reassure him, but Asher knew better. Merrick was no fool. They had both been trained in the art of watching for danger. This night wasn't just about a toast, it was about survival. And Evie, that mysterious, mortal girl, had given him the warning. Evie Darnell could barely breathe. She weaved through the crowd, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the nobles around her could hear it. Her hands were clammy, her feet light but unsteady on the marble floors. She had been nothing more than a humble servant, invisible to everyone except the king. But tonight, everything had changed. She had never imagined she would find herself caught in the middle of a royal assassination plot, much less risk her life to stop it. The Lycan court, with its intricate webs of power and betrayal, was far beyond her world. And yet, here she was, caught in the tumultuous pull of events far too grand for someone like her to control. She had always stayed in the background, quietly serving the nobles as they indulged in their decadent lives. It was the only way to survive. But now, her survival depended on actions she had never considered before. And there was him, the Wolf King, Asher Blackthorn. Evie's stomach turned at the thought of him, and not just because of the powerful position he held. No, it was the strange magnetic pull she felt every time their eyes met, a deep, unspoken connection that grew with each passing day. She had always known that he was untouchable, a king who stood above it all, and yet there was something in his eyes, something she had glimpsed when he met her gaze after she had handed him the note. Something human, vulnerable even. She had only meant to warn him, to do her part in saving a life, but now she wasn't so sure she could walk away. What would her life look like if she returned to her ordinary duties after this? Would she even be allowed to? Could she go back to being a servant after what she had done? Her hands shook as she placed a tray on a nearby table, her eyes darting back toward Asher. He was still pretending to drink, still holding the goblet in front of him as if nothing had changed, but Evie knew better. She had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes before he tucked the note away. He understood now. She had warned him. He would know to act. But what came next? The thought of leaving the castle, of returning to her small cottage on the outskirts of the kingdom, seemed impossible now. She had never been part of anything this grand, this dangerous. Evie's heart skipped as she spotted Asher moving through the crowd, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his steps deliberate. It was time. She had done what she could, but now it seemed he would take control. Whatever happened next, she would be a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Asher stepped away from the banquet table, his movements fluid as if he had done it 1,000 times before. His heart, once steady, was now pounding in his chest. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the gnawing realization that he had been betrayed. The poisoning plot was no accident, no simple mishap in his court. It had been planned, calculated, and executed with a level of precision that suggested someone had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He had no illusions about his kingdom. As the Wolf King, he had always known there would be enemies, within his ranks, perhaps even within his own family. But the reality of it, the stark knowledge that someone close to him had tried to kill him, was unsettling. He had to find out who. He needed to know how deep this betrayal ran. And there was Evie, the mortal girl who had warned him. His instincts had been right to question her. He knew something was different about her, something that separated her from the rest of the court's servants. She was bold, not just in her actions, but in the way she looked at him, as if she wasn't afraid to see the truth. But what was she to him? A servant? An ally? Or something more? Asher stepped into the shadows of the corridor, his mind racing. The night had shifted, and with it, the very course of his life. He had ruled through bloodshed and loyalty, but now, it seemed, survival would require something more, something he wasn't sure he had. The corridor was quiet, the distant sounds of the banquet muffled by the thick stone walls. Evie stood near the door, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tried to steady herself. She had warned him, but now what? She didn't have time to prepare for what happened next. Asher appeared at the far end of the corridor, his eyes locked onto hers. The air between them seemed to thrum with a charged intensity, the weight of his presence filling the space. He was close now, his gaze sharp, his posture commanding. "You," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Why would you risk your life for mine?" Evie swallowed, her mouth dry. She had expected him to be angry, to demand answers, but there was something else in his voice. Curiosity? No, it was something deeper, something that unnerved her. She met his gaze, trying to stand her ground, but the words caught in her throat. "I had to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your actions, what you've done to my people, have consequences. I couldn't sit by and watch you die." A long silence followed. Asher didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You understand the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his voice almost too quiet. "The court will be watching. The consequences of this," he glanced down at her trembling hands, "could cost you everything." Evie's heart skipped. "I know, but I couldn't let you die." Asher's gaze softened for the briefest moment, and in that instant something passed between them, something fragile, raw, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the cold, calculating king. "I must find the traitor," Asher said quietly. "And when I do, I will make them pay. But first, I must return to my court." "You," he paused, his voice hardening again, "are coming with me." The heavy silence of Blackthorn Castle seemed to settle deeper with each passing hour. Asher paced through his private quarters, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The halls had emptied, and the grand banquet had ended, but his mind was far from at ease. He knew that the shadows of betrayal had grown long, stretching farther than he had anticipated. The court, his court, was rotting from within, and the girl, Evie, had unknowingly become the catalyst that would unravel it all. Asher's thoughts flickered back to her, Evie Darnell. She was no ordinary servant. No, something about her was different, something ancient buried deep within her that even she wasn't fully aware of. He had seen the way her hands trembled when she warned him of the poison, but it wasn't just fear he sensed, it was something more, something primal. He hadn't spoken of it to her, not yet. But tonight, he would. The Lycan bloodline was ancient, older than the kingdoms Asher had conquered, older than the very lands he now ruled. He had lived through it all, the rise and fall of dynasties, the wars, the alliances. He had watched as his people, his pack, became a force to be reckoned with, their power cemented in the history of the world. But for all the power he wielded, there were parts of his history he couldn't quite trace, parts of his past that had been buried, erased, forgotten. And it was these pieces that now tugged at him, urging him to look closer at Evie. Over the past few days, Asher had started his quiet investigation, asking questions no one else dared ask. It wasn't just curiosity. It was necessity. Evie had warned him, and in doing so, she had placed herself in danger. There was no going back for her. Not anymore. But the more he learned, the more he realized that she was tied to something far greater than he could have imagined. Evie was a descendant of the Valenhold, an ancient and long-thought extinct Lycan clan, a clan known for their connection to the land, the primal forces of nature that had been lost to the passage of time. The Valenhold were known to have once been guardians of an ancient prophecy, one that foretold the arrival of a ruler who would change the fate of both mortals and Lycans. That ruler was supposed to bring balance, a king who would bridge the divide between the two races, uniting them under a common banner. But the prophecy was never realized. Over the century of the Maaz, the Valenhold were hunted to extinction, their bloodline erased from the records, and the prophecy buried in the ashes of their fall. Until now. Asher had suspected it. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first, but now the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Evie wasn't just a mortal servant. She was something much more, a key to a new beginning, a harbinger of change. His thoughts raced as he considered the implications of what this meant. Could Evie truly be the one to fulfill the prophecy? Could she be the ruler the kingdom had been waiting for? He didn't know yet, but what he did know was that he needed to protect her, keep her safe from the growing danger that lurked in the shadows of his court. The lycanthrope court was a dangerous game. The very blood that ran through the veins of his council, his advisors, could betray him. Asher knew this. He had known it for centuries, but the depth of the conspiracy now unfolding was unlike anything he had ever anticipated. Lord Corwin, the trusted advisor who had been at his side for years, was the mastermind behind the assassination plot. Asher had been watching Corwin for weeks. noticing subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he maneuvered through the court with an unsettling quietness. Corwin had always been a man of great ambition, but he had seemed loyal until now. Asher had suspected for some time that Corwin was no mere opportunist. He was a player in something much larger. Tonight, that suspicion would be confirmed. The confrontation was inevitable. Asher summoned Corwin to his private chambers, the tension between them palpable the moment the door closed behind him. Asher stood near the window, his back to the counselor, staring out at the moonlit landscape. Corwin was quiet, watching him, waiting for the king to speak. "You think I don't know?" Asher's voice was low, steady, like the growl of a wolf just before it strikes. He turned to face Corwin, his amber eyes cold and piercing. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Corwin stood tall, his hands folded behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, I don't understand what you're implying." Asher took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You've been poisoning my court with lies, manipulating my council to take my throne. You thought you could have me killed and replace me, didn't you?" Corwin's lips twitched, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've done what I had to do to secure the future of the lycanthropes. You've grown weak, Asher. A king who no longer commands respect. You've spent too much time in the shadows of your own empire, forgetting what it means to rule." Asher's claws, hidden beneath his human skin, began to flex, but he didn't allow his anger to boil over. He was calm, collected. He had been betrayed before. He would survive this too. "You were a fool, Corwin," Asher said, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could manipulate me, but you're just a pawn in a much larger game. The throne you want isn't yours to take, not by poison, not by lies." Corwin's eyes narrowed, his smirk disappearing. "Then why are we having this conversation, Your Majesty? You know as well as I do that your time is running out." "Not yet," Asher growled, stepping closer. "Not while I still draw breath." The silence between them thickened. Corwin finally dropped his act, revealing his true intentions. "I didn't expect this. I thought you would be easier to dispose of, but it seems the king still has a fight left in him." Asher's gaze locked onto Corwin, fury simmering beneath the surface. "You've betrayed me. You've betrayed us all, and you'll pay the price for it." Corwin's face twisted in anger. "You think I'm the only one who wants a change? The court has turned against you, Asher. The time of the Wolf King is over. I will take what's mine." Before he could react, Asher lunged. The air around them crackled with the power of the Alpha, his speed and strength overwhelming Corwin. He was pinned against the stone wall, gasping for breath. "Your reign ends here," Asher growled, his voice a low growl in the night. "And the kingdom will know what happens to traitors." After the confrontation, Asher turned his attention back to Evie. The night had changed everything. He could feel the pull between them, the bond that was forming, and it was undeniable. But the danger wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Evie had gone into hiding after the confrontation in the hall, but Asher was determined to keep her safe. He moved swiftly, ensuring that she had shelter within the confines of his private chambers, far from the prying eyes of the court. Evie, however, was no longer the same girl who had quietly served at the banquet. Asher could see it in her eyes, in the way she held herself. Her transformation had already begun, subtle but undeniable. There were moments when she would touch her skin, as if feeling the change within her. Her heartbeat had quickened, and her senses had heightened in ways she couldn't understand. It was as if she were slowly becoming something more than mortal, and she was. Asher watched her closely, noticing the way her eyes glowed faintly under the moonlight. It was a sign, one that he had seen before in his own kind. Her Lycan bloodline, tied to the prophecy, was awakening. She wasn't just the key to his survival anymore. She was becoming part of the very fabric of his world. Evie didn't yet understand the full extent of the transformation, but Asher knew it was only a matter of time before the bond between them would draw her fully into the lycanthrope world. Evie's transformation was just beginning. She could feel the change stirring within her, the pull of something ancient and powerful. But she didn't yet know what it meant, what it would cost, and Asher, too, was caught between his desire to protect her and the realization that the prophecy would soon come to pass. The danger was far from over. Lord Corwin's betrayal was only the tip of the iceberg. Asher's kingdom, once secure, was now on the brink of collapse, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Evie Darnell had changed everything, and now, together, they would face the consequences. Evie Darnell stood by the large window in Asher's private chambers, her hands pressed against the cool glass. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of rain, the sky a dark canvas illuminated by flashes of distant lightning. Her reflection in the glass looked like someone else, a woman who had barely been alive an hour ago and who now was struggling to understand what she had become. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted any of it. One moment, she was just a servant, moving quietly through the halls of Blackthorn Castle, doing her job. The next, she had become the key to something that threatened to unravel everything she had ever known. The sensation inside her was impossible to ignore. A deep, primal urge rising within her, pulling her away from the world she had always inhabited. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear she felt, at least not the kind she recognized. It was something different, something ancient. Evie turned away from the window and walked across the room, her steps heavy with the weight of the change. It felt as though she were losing herself piece by piece, but there was no escape. The transformation had already begun, and with it, an overwhelming flood of new senses, new feelings, things that shouldn't belong to her. She could feel the air moving, the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the vibrations in the walls. Her senses had grown sharper, but not in a way that felt like a gift. It felt like a curse. Her skin tingled as if the blood within her was being rewritten, replaced with something darker, something untouchable. When she closed her eyes, she could feel the pull of the moon, its ancient power whispering to her, calling her to something deeper. But she wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to be anything other than human. The thought of the lycanthrope world, with its unrelenting power and fearsome creatures, made her stomach twist. She had always kept to the edges of the court, invisible, safe from the violence that simmered beneath its surface. But now, she could feel it creeping into her bones. She was no longer a bystander. Evie took a deep breath and glanced at her reflection again. Her eyes, once a soft hazel, had begun to change, the color now tinged with something far more dangerous. They gleamed with an unnatural glow in the dim light. Her skin, too, felt different, smoother, more vibrant, as if her body were being rewritten from the inside out. She hadn't been able to sleep, not since the night of the banquet. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories of what she had done, the warning to Asher, the poisoning, the blood pact, swirled through her mind, confusing her sense of right and wrong. The moment she had slipped him the note, she had unknowingly crossed a line she could never uncross. She had entered a world far darker than the one she had left behind. And now, she was part of it. The transformation wasn't just physical. The deeper she delved into the lycanthrope world, the more she felt herself pulled into something primal, something untamed. Every step she took seemed to carry her farther away from the quiet, simple life she had always known. She had never been meant for power, for dominance. She had been a healer, a servant, a caretaker. And yet, here she was, on the verge of becoming something entirely different. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Asher. He had saved her, yes, but what had he truly done? The blood pact, the ancient ritual that bound them together, it was irreversible. She had seen the look in his eyes when he had offered it, and even though his words were calm, his silence betrayed a deep, gnawing worry. He didn't want to do it, but he had no choice. Neither of them did. Evie could still feel the pull of his presence, even from across the room. It was strange, how quickly their fates had become intertwined. Her chest tightened as she thought of him. His fierce protectiveness, his cold exterior that hid the depth of his loneliness. He had fought for centuries, and now he was offering her his strength, his blood, as if it were the only way to save her. The door to Asher's chambers creaked open, and Evie turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the flickering candlelight. His eyes, the color of molten amber, locked onto hers. There was a tension in the air, a quiet storm that seemed to hang between them. "You've been restless," Asher said, his voice smooth but laced with concern. Evie didn't answer at first. She simply looked at him, her gaze searching for answers in his. But the weight of the moment settled in between them, too thick to ignore. She could feel the connection between them, the bond they had forged when he had saved her life. That bond was growing, shifting, becoming something far more powerful than either of them had intended. "I don't want this," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't ask for this." Asher took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. "I know you didn't, Evie. But you don't have a choice now. Neither of us does." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. Evie's pulse quickened, and for a moment she felt a rush of something wild, something dangerous, rise within her. She had never been drawn to power, never wanted to wield it, but now she could feel the weight of the lichen bloodline pulsing through her veins. She could feel the change, the strength, the hunger. "I can save you," Asher continued, his voice low, "but only if you agree to the blood pact." Evie swallowed, her throat dry. "What will it mean for me? For us?" "It will bind us together. Your fate will be tied to mine, and the transformation you're already feeling, it will be complete. You'll be lycanthrope, not fully mortal, not fully anything." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You'll be with me. Always." Evie's breath hitched, and she turned away, looking out the window once more. The storm outside had reached its peak, rain slashing against the stone of the castle. The world outside seemed so far removed from what she had known, a world of quiet moments and simple joys. She had never thought she would become part of something so dangerous, so powerful. But here she was. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. The poison, still lingering in her veins, was a constant reminder that there was no going back. She had been marked, chosen, for something far greater than she had ever imagined. And if she didn't accept the pact, the poison would eventually claim her, just as the conspirators had intended. But what did it mean to be tied to Asher? To be bound by blood? To become something more than human? "I don't know if I can do this," Evie said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence between them. Asher's hand reached out, gently tilting her chin so she met his gaze. His eyes were softer now, as if he could see the turmoil inside her. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I won't let you fall." Evie's heart ached at his words, but the fear still lingered. What would it mean for her to be with him, to be bound by this power? But she had no choice. The silence stretched on, the storm outside now raging in full force, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Evie felt Asher's presence beside her, unwavering and constant, but the weight of his offer, the blood pact, felt heavier than anything she had ever known. Finally, she took a shaky breath, her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't want to become a monster," she said, her voice small but firm. Asher stepped closer, his voice gentle but resolute. "You won't become a monster, Evie. You will become more than what you were. You will become stronger, and you'll never have to face this alone." Evie closed her eyes for a moment, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. She knew she had no choice. The poison, the transformation, it was all leading to this moment. She could either die, or she could fight, even if it meant losing herself in the process. All right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Do it! Asher's eyes softened, and he nodded. His hand gently cupped her cheek, his touch sending a ripple of warmth through her. This will change everything, he murmured, his voice low and filled with quiet strength. With that, he leaned forward, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke the ancient words of the blood pact. Evie's body shuddered, the change overtaking her all at once. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever felt, an explosion of power, of heat, rushing through her veins. It burned, it ached, it was both agony and ecstasy. And then, as the pain receded, she felt it, a deep, unbreakable bond, her soul and his, forever tied together. Evie's transformation was complete. She could feel the power coursing through her, strong, untamable, but still foreign. She was no longer just a servant, she was something new, something caught between two worlds, and with that power came the responsibility of a fate she had never asked for. Asher stood beside her, his presence a constant reminder that they were now bound, by blood, by fate, and by a shared destiny neither of them had anticipated. But in that moment, Evie knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. The transformation had been quick, too quick. But as the power coursed through her veins, Evie Darnell could no longer deny what she had become. Every part of her, the pulse of her blood, the way her senses stretched out like tendrils, felt different, sharper. It was as though her body and her mind were catching up to something that had been waiting inside her all along. In the days that followed the blood pact, Evie struggled to keep herself grounded. Her mortal heart still beat with the pain of the world she had known, the simplicity of her cottage, the quiet life she had once led, the family she had left behind. But that life felt like a distant dream, something she could no longer return to, and the weight of what she had become, part mortal, part lichen, was a burden that had only grown heavier with each passing hour. But she wasn't alone. Asher was always near, always watching, always guiding. His presence had become something of a comfort, and she found herself drawn to him more than she cared to admit. He, too, had felt the bond they shared, the pull of their shared blood, and it was in that connection that they found strength. Together, they began to unlock the power of the lichen bloodline that flowed within her, and with it, a shared determination to reclaim the throne from the traitor, Lord Corwin. Evie sat in the dimly lit chamber, the cool stone walls surrounding her as Asher paced nearby, his footsteps steady but full of intent. They had been working together to help her control the newfound powers that surged through her. Powers that, in the past, she would have only heard about in hushed whispers. The strength of the lichen bloodline, the connection to the moon, the heightened senses, the speed, the agility, the ferocity, but none of it felt natural, not yet. Asher stopped in front of her, his amber eyes searching hers. How do you feel? Evie hesitated before answering, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. I feel powerful, she said quietly, as though the admission might make her lose control. But I can't control it, not yet. Asher nodded, understanding. It's not about control. It's about understanding what you've become. You are no longer just mortal. You are tied to something ancient, something primal, and you need to learn to let that power flow through you, not resist it. Evie took a deep breath, closing her eyes. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and she could feel it, a presence inside her that had always been dormant. Her mind reached out, and she let the power run through her like a current, feeling the sharpness of her senses, the strength in her limbs, the way the world seemed to slow down just slightly when she focused. Her heart raced as the rush of power surged through her, and her hands shook, but she steadied herself. The more she embraced it, the less it felt like a stranger. It felt like her own. I can feel it, she whispered, her eyes still closed. It's overwhelming, but it's mine. Good, Asher said, his voice low but proud. It's a part of you now. You will learn to harness it. I'll be here. every step of the way. Evie opened her eyes and met his gaze, feeling something stir between them, an understanding. She had never wanted this, but now, with the power she had, it felt as though she had no choice. Her bond with Asher was more than just a connection forged in blood. It was something deeper, something that had changed the course of both their lives. The quiet tension in Blackthorn Castle was palpable. Asher had been gathering his loyal followers, those who had remained steadfast in their loyalty to the true king, and together they were planning their next move. The rebellion that had once been a distant thought was now real, a war that had already begun, and one that would determine the future of both lycanthropes and mortals. Lord Corwin, the traitor who had once been a trusted advisor, was consolidating his power. His supporters had begun to infiltrate the Lycan court, sowing the seeds of doubt and mistrust among those who still supported Asher. He was methodical, careful, and ruthless, traits that made him a dangerous enemy. Asher knew that he would need to act quickly, but he also knew that the war would not be won with force alone. It would require strategy, cunning, and the strength of those who still believed in the old ways. Evie, for her part, had become an integral part of the planning. Asher had shared the details of the rebellion with her, trusting her instincts as much as he trusted his own. She had become more than just a participant. She was a partner, someone whose insight was as valuable as any general's. And the more she worked with him, the more Evie realized that the world she was now a part of was not just about power, it was about loyalty, betrayal, and the very fabric of what it meant to rule. But even as they planned, the storm outside Blackthorn Castle was growing. Evie could feel it in the air, the growing sense of anticipation. The rebellion was on the horizon, and there was no turning back. Evie sat by the window, staring out at the swirling dark clouds above. The storm had intensified, the wind howling through the trees. It mirrored the storm within her, the conflict between who she had been and who she was becoming. She was no longer the woman who had quietly served in the castle, hidden from the chaos of the court. She was part of it now, and she was no longer sure where her place was. She had always known her world would change, but not like this. The woman she had been, the healer, the servant, the girl who had run from the violence of the lycanthrope world, felt like someone else, someone she couldn't even recognize anymore. She had become something powerful, but it came with a price. And then there was Asher. Asher had always been the king, the ruler, the one who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, but now there was something more between them, something unspoken. She could feel the bond between them, the bond of blood, and it was undeniable. She could sense his strength, his determination, but also the weight of his burdens. His kingdom was at war, and yet he was fighting a battle that went far beyond his throne. He was fighting for a future, for both Lycans and mortals alike. Evie's heart clenched at the thought. Asher's world had always been one of dominance and survival. But what he wanted now, what he needed, was something different. He needed a partner. And that partner, whether he realized it or not, was her. But what did that mean for her? Her hand clenched around the fabric of her dress as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. She could feel the weight of the choice ahead. The world she had once known, the quiet, peaceful life with her family, was slipping further away. She could never go back, not now. The first battles had been fought. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that raged within the castle walls. Asher's forces were preparing for what was to come, but the outcome was uncertain. Lord Corwin's forces were not easily defeated, and the betrayal that had set this war into motion ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Evie's powers were growing, but so was the weight of her role in the fight. Asher's trust in her had deepened, but so had the stakes. She could no longer remain an observer. She had to fight. The war was only beginning, and Evie had already chosen her side. But as she stood alongside Asher, ready to face whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain. This battle would change everything, not just for the kingdom, but for them both. The rebellion had begun. and neither Evie nor Asher could afford to lose. The air was thick with the scent of blood and ash as Asher Blackthorn stood at the edge of the battlefield, his amber eyes scanning the chaos that surrounded him. The clashing of steel on steel, the growls and snarls of lichens locked in combat, the cries of pain, all of it was a symphony of war, one that had been a long time coming. The storm that had been brewing for weeks was finally breaking, and the outcome would determine the future of the Lichen Kingdom. The castle of Blackthorn had once been a symbol of untouchable power, a fortress where Asher had ruled with an iron fist. But that reign had been torn from him, ripped away by the traitor Lord Corwin and his followers. Now Asher had returned, not as the king he once was, but as a force of nature, his power renewed and his mind sharpened by the knowledge that this battle was his last chance. His army, loyal and ready, had gathered at the castle gates, facing Corwin's forces in a final confrontation. This was no longer about just reclaiming a throne. It was about survival, about taking back what was rightfully his, and about the future of his kingdom. The very heart of lycanthrope society was on the line, and the fight for its soul had begun. But Asher wasn't alone. Evie stood beside him, her newly awakened powers a force to be reckoned with. She had come so far since the night of the Blood Pact. Once a servant, now a warrior. Her transformation was complete, and she had become a vital part of his strength. Together, they would face the rebellion, the betrayal, and the war that had torn their world apart. Asher's chest rose and fell with each heavy breath. The battlefield was nothing like the polished halls of Blackthorn Castle. There were no banquets, no courtly intrigues, no veiled whispers of betrayal. Here, there was only the harsh reality of war and the battle for his kingdom. He could feel the power inside him, his lichen blood surging through his veins, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The air tasted sweeter now, more alive with every beat of his heart. He had returned to the battlefield, not as a king who had once ruled with an iron fist, but as something stronger, something far older, far more dangerous. Corwin's forces were no match for him, Asher knew. The traitor and his army were disorganized, scattered, and driven by a weak ideology. They were trying to wrest control from him, but they lacked the one thing that would make them truly dangerous, the heart of the Lichen people. Asher had that heart, and he would show them what it meant to betray him. He turned to Evie, who was standing at his side, her expression set with a fierce determination. She was still learning to control her new abilities, but already Asher had seen the strength within her. Her mortal heart had been replaced by something more, something wild. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and Asher could feel her power pulsing beside his own. Together, they were unstoppable. "Stay close," Asher said, his voice low and commanding. "This battle isn't over yet." Evie nodded, her silver eyes gleaming with resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, her voice steady. The roar of battle intensified as Asher led his forces toward the center of the fray. The lichens loyal to him clashed with Corwin's followers, the sound of fighting filling the air. In the midst of it all, Asher moved like a force of nature, his body an extension of the power that coursed through him. His claws, sharpened to deadly points, tore through his enemies with ease. His teeth, gleaming white, sank into the flesh of traitors who dared to cross his path. And Evie was there, beside him, her newfound abilities allowing her to fight as an equal. She no longer felt the weight of her past life, the limitations of her mortality. Now, she moved with the speed and precision of a lichen, her strength amplifying with each strike. The power within her surged with every moment, and with it she felt a growing connection to Asher, to the world they were now a part of. Together, they were a force of destruction. As the battle raged on, Evie found herself moving through the battlefield with a grace and power that was entirely foreign to her. Her senses were heightened, her reflexes quicker, her strength more than human. She could hear every sound, the screams, the clash of weapons, the pounding of her own heart. She could smell the blood in the air, the tang of sweat and earth, the sharp scent of fear. But amidst the chaos, she felt something else, something more important. She felt Asher's presence, guiding her, protecting her, and she knew, without a doubt, that they were in this together. The bond between them had become something unbreakable. He was her king, her protector, but more than that, he was her equal in this fight. And with every battle they fought side by side, she felt her own power grow stronger. In the distance, she saw Corwin standing at the edge of the battlefield, directing his forces. His once placid face was twisted with rage and frustration as he watched his army falter before Asher's power. Corwin had underestimated them. He had underestimated her. Evie's lips curved into a fierce smile as she charged forward, her newfound strength propelling her across the battlefield. She no longer felt powerless. She no longer felt like a servant. She was a warrior, standing beside the king who had given her a chance to fight for what was right. And fight she did. With every strike, every movement, she grew stronger, more confident. She could feel her Lycan blood rushing through her, and she knew this was her new reality. This was who she was meant to be. But just as victory seemed within reach, as the last of Corwin's forces began to retreat, a final, devastating betrayal was revealed. Asher had been so focused on defeating Corwin and reclaiming his throne that he hadn't seen the betrayal lurking in his own ranks. It came from someone close to him, someone he had trusted, a member of his inner circle who had been feeding information to Corwin all along. The moment the truth was revealed, everything shifted. Asher's forces faltered, confusion spreading like wildfire among his loyalists. The traitor had already made their move, and now the battle for the kingdom was more uncertain than ever. Asher's amber eyes widened as he saw the figure stepping forward, a shadow in the distance. It was one of his closest allies, a man who had stood by his side for years. But now he was smiling, a sickly grin twisting his face. "I should have known," Asher growled under his breath. The betrayal was as old as his reign itself, and now it had come to fruition. "Corwin was just the beginning," the traitor said, his voice cold and triumphant. "You've lost, Asher. The kingdom belongs to those who are willing to do whatever it takes." The truth of the betrayal hit Asher like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily stunned. His army, his kingdom, everything he had fought for was hanging in the balance. But even as the weight of the revelation settled over him, he knew there was only one thing left to do. He had to fight back. With Evie at his side, they would face this betrayal head-on. The forces of Corwin, the traitors within his own ranks, none of it mattered anymore. Asher's kingdom, his future, and their shared fate were now irrevocably tied together, and they would fight for it, no matter the cost. Asher stood tall, his eyes burning with renewed purpose. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. The bloodshed had stained the soil of Blackthorn Castle, the echoes of the rebellion still ringing in the hallways. The traitors had been cast down, and Lord Corwin, once so certain of his rise to power, now lay crumpled at Asher's feet, his life snuffed out in a moment of fiery retribution. But for all the victory that came with the fall of Corwin, the throne, once a symbol of power and dominance, had become something else in Asher's eyes, a hollow seat, one that could never again be filled in the same way. Asher stood before the grand throne room, his gaze fixed on the empty seat at the head of the chamber. His heart, once so sure of itself, now weighed heavy in his chest. He had spent centuries building an empire, forging a reign out of fear and fire. He had ruled as a king, a beast at the heart of his kingdom. But now, after all the bloodshed, after all the betrayals, and with the throne within his grasp again, he was no longer sure of what he wanted. Evie stood beside him, her presence solid and reassuring. The bond between them, forged in blood and battle, had grown only stronger. She had changed, transformed into something far more than just a mortal servant. She was his equal now, and in a way, his salvation. But as he looked at her, Asher knew that her place in the kingdom was no longer just as a companion in his fight. She was a queen now, whether either of them were ready for that role or not. The throne had been reclaimed, but it felt empty. The court had gathered once again, but there was a silence in the air that hung like a shroud over everything. The lycanthropes, his people, were no longer the same. They had been shaped by the rebellion, by the betrayal, and by the new world they had stepped into. Asher took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze scanning the room. The nobles, those who had remained loyal, watched him with cautious eyes. The room felt different now, heavier. His presence, once commanding and unyielding, now seemed distant, almost foreign. The lycanthropes had followed him for centuries, but now there was a new order to be built, a new way of ruling that had to be forged from the ashes of the old kingdom. Asher knew this. The power he had once wielded with ruthless dominance had already begun to crumble. His kingdom, as it had existed, was no longer a place where strength alone could maintain order. What would it mean now to sit upon the throne? And yet, it was his. He had fought for it, bled for it. The loyalty of his people, the sacrifices, all of it had been for this moment. The throne was his to claim, but did he even want it? Asher's eyes flickered to Evie, standing beside him. She had seen the war, the battle for the throne. But more than that, she had seen him, the man beneath the crown. And in that moment, he knew that her place in this court, in this kingdom, was more than just a symbol of victory. She was a leader now. She had become more than just his partner in battle. She had become the voice of reason, the one who would help guide him through the uncertainty that lay ahead. Asher's thoughts were interrupted by the murmur of the court as he moved to take his seat upon the throne. He felt their eyes on him, their anticipation, but it was nothing like the feeling he had once felt when they had looked to him for answers. There was no fear in their gaze now, only uncertainty. He could feel the weight of his reign pressing down on him, the familiar sense of authority no longer as comforting as it had been. Sitting upon the throne, Asher realized, was no longer about power. It was about responsibility, a responsibility he wasn't sure he wanted to shoulder anymore. He had fought for the throne, yes, but in doing so, he had lost so much. The bloodshed, the betrayal, the sacrifices. He had built this kingdom on a foundation of fear, and now it felt like the very ground beneath him was eroding. Evie's transformation was complete. The girl who had once been a servant, a healer, was now a force in her own right. But what would it mean for her to stand beside him as queen, ruling this fractured kingdom? Asher had no answers for that. The bond between them was strong, but the weight of what lay ahead was more than either of them could fathom. His heart ached as he thought of the future. What kind of king could he be if he no longer believed in the way of the past? Evie looked at him, her silver eyes meeting his with an understanding that few others could comprehend. She had been with him through the battle, through the bloodshed, and now she would be with him as they faced the task of rebuilding their world. "You don't have to do this alone," Evie said quietly, her voice steady and sure. Her words, simple as they were, struck something deep inside him. He had always ruled alone, standing apart from the world he controlled. But now, for the first time, Asher wasn't sure he wanted to carry the weight of the crown alone. "I don't want to be king," he confessed, the words feeling heavier than he'd imagined. Evie stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his. "You don't have to be what you were before," she said softly. "This kingdom, it's changing. You're changing." Asher stared at her for a moment, the realization sinking in. The throne, his kingdom, was no longer a symbol of ruthless rule. It was a symbol of something else, something they would have to build together. And that terrified him, but it also gave him hope. He couldn't undo the past, the bloodshed, the cruelty. It had already shaped the kingdom, shaped the Lycans who followed him, but there was a chance now, a chance to reshape the future, to create something that wasn't built on fear but on something stronger: unity. The court had quieted, the murmur of the nobles fading into an uncomfortable silence. Evie could feel the weight of their gaze upon her, and for the first time she realized the full scope of what she had become. She was no longer just a servant, no longer just an outsider in a world she could never belong to. She had been transformed, both physically and spiritually, and now her place in this world was more than just the role she had once accepted. She was Asher's partner, not just in battle, but in ruling the kingdom. Evie could feel her heart race at the thought. She wasn't ready for this. She had never asked for it. And yet, here she was. She had gone from being the quiet servant in the background to standing before the highest court in the kingdom, her future as uncertain as the kingdom itself. But she wasn't alone. Asher had always been a king, ruthless and proud, but now she could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty, the doubt. He no longer wanted to rule as he had before, but that didn't mean he had given up on his kingdom. It meant he was ready for change, and that was where she came in. Evie had learned much from Asher, about power, about leadership, about what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself, but now she had to decide what kind of queen she would be. The kingdom would look to her just as much as it would look to him, and her decisions, her voice, would be just as important as his. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," Evie whispered, her voice barely audible. Asher's hand tightened around hers. "You don't have to be," he said quietly. "But we'll do it together. We'll change this kingdom. We'll rebuild it, not just for us, but for everyone." Evie nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. They were no longer just rulers of lycanthropes. They were the architects of a new world, and it was one they would have to shape together. As the court began to stir once again, the whispers of change spread like wildfire. Asher, sitting upon the throne, no longer saw it as the symbol of his reign, but as a starting point, a beginning. The kingdom had been fractured, but now it was theirs to rebuild, to reshape into something that could last. But as Asher looked at Evie, standing beside him, her gaze steady and filled with determination, he knew that their true battle was just beginning. The kingdom would be theirs, but what kind of rulers would they be? What kind of future could they build together? As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows of Blackthorn Castle, Asher knew one thing for certain. The past had shaped them, but it was the future they would create that would define their legacy. Together, they would decide what kind of kingdom would rise from the ashes of betrayal and bloodshed. And that, more than anything, was the greatest challenge they would face. The moon hung low over Blackthorn Castle, its pale light casting long shadows over the ruins of the battlefield. The storm that had ravaged the kingdom had passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness in its wake. The echoes of war, of betrayal and bloodshed, were now distant whispers. But the weight of what had happened, of the changes that had come, still pressed heavily upon the shoulders of those who remained. Asher stood at the balcony of his private chambers, his gaze lost in the endless expanse of the night. The air was thick with the promise of something new, something that had been long overdue. His kingdom had been built on fear, on power, and on the dominance of the lycanthropes over the mortals. But that world was gone now. He had fought to reclaim his throne, to rebuild what had been lost, but in doing so, he had come to a realization that had shaken him to his core. The throne he had sought so desperately no longer had the same meaning. Power, dominance. It had all been a lie that had led to nothing but pain, suffering, and the eventual fall of everything he had fought for. Now, standing at the edge of the world he once knew, Asher had made his decision. Asher had always been a man of action, a king who ruled with a heavy hand, his presence both feared and revered. But the events of the past few weeks, Corwin's betrayal, the rise of the rebellion, the blood pact with Evie, had opened his eyes. He had always believed that power came from fear, that a ruler had to be strong, unyielding. But in that belief, he had forgotten something crucial. True strength lay in unity, in understanding, and in the ability to change. The old ways, the ways that had built his empire, were flawed. Asher could no longer stand by them. He couldn't continue to rule a kingdom that had been built on the blood of innocence, on lies and manipulation. He had seen too much destruction, too much pain, to ever allow it to happen again. The old order needed to fall, and with it, the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued the Lycans and mortals alike. He turned to face the room behind him, his eyes meeting Evie's. She had been the catalyst for his change, the one who had shown him a different way, a way that didn't rely on fear, but on respect. She had always been his strength, and now, together, they would build something new. Asher walked towards her, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. He had spent so long fighting for power, for control, that he had never stopped to question what he truly wanted. But now, with Evie by his side, he knew what had to be done. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. Evie nodded, her silver eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. "The kingdom will change," she said softly, "but we will change it together." Asher's hand reached out, brushing against hers. The bond they shared, forged in blood and power, had become something stronger than either of them could have imagined. It was a union not just of two souls, but of two worlds, the lycanthropes and the mortals, and it was a symbol of the new kingdom they would build together. "We'll dismantle the old order," Asher said, his voice firm, "and we'll build a kingdom of equality, a kingdom where mortals and Lycans coexist, where power isn't ruled by fear, but by respect." Evie's gaze softened as she stepped closer to him. "A kingdom where both can stand side by side." Asher nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he felt the burden of the throne lifting, not because he had relinquished it, but because he had redefined it. The power he had fought so hard for would no longer be a symbol of control, but of hope. The court had gathered in the great hall once again. But this time the atmosphere was different. The air was no longer thick with tension, but with anticipation. Asher stood at the head of the room, his posture tall and regal, but there was a calmness to him now, a quiet strength that had replaced the fear and dominance of his old reign. Beside him stood Evie, her presence undeniable. The bond between them was clear, and the court had begun to see her not as just a servant, but as a leader in her own right. The transformation from mortal to queen had been completed, and with it, a new path had been forged for the kingdom, a path of cooperation, understanding, and equality. Asher stepped forward, his voice carrying through the hall. "Lycans and mortals alike, we stand at the dawn of a new era. The kingdom you once knew, built on power and fear, is no more. We will rebuild together. This is a kingdom for all, where both races can live side by side, not in conflict, but in harmony." The nobles in the hall exchanged wary glances, but there was something different in Asher's voice, a conviction that hadn't been there before. They had known him as the king who demanded respect through power, but now they were hearing a king who sought it through unity. Evie stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. "The past is behind us, but it will not be forgotten. We must learn from our mistakes, so we do not repeat them. The cycle of violence ends now, and the cycle of betrayal ends now." The court fell silent. The weight of Evie's words settled over them like a heavy blanket. It was a promise, a declaration, and it was clear that she was no longer just a figure beside Asher. She was his equal, his partner in this new kingdom. The first steps towards the new court had been taken. The system that had once been built on favor and fear was now being replaced with one based on fairness, respect, and justice. Mortals would no longer be seen as subjugated beings, and Lycans would no longer see themselves as rulers by birthright. It would be a court where both races had a voice, and they would not be alone in this endeavor. Many of the nobles who had once feared Asher's wrath now saw the wisdom in his words, the strength in his vision. Some would resist the change, but the kingdom was ready for the transformation. The rebellion had been their first battle, but the real fight, building a kingdom that lasted, was just beginning. Asher stood with Evie at the head of the room, looking out at the faces of his court. The world he had fought for had changed, and so had he. The throne that had once been a symbol of power was now a symbol of hope, a beacon for a new kingdom built on unity and equality. There would be challenges ahead, betrayal would not be easily erased, and the scars of the past would not heal overnight. But Asher was no longer afraid. He had chosen his path, and with Evie at his side, he knew they could rebuild this kingdom from the ground up. The dawn of a new era had arrived, and together, Asher and Evie would shape it into something that would last for generations to come. The kingdom had changed, transformed beyond recognition, and Asher could feel the shift in the air with every passing day. Where once there had been tension and suspicion between mortals and lichens, there was now a fragile but growing unity. The old power structures, built on blood and fear, had crumbled, replaced by a new order, an order that celebrated equality and respect for all. And at the heart of it all was Asher and Evie. Asher stood on the balcony of the newly restored Blackthorn Castle, the cool night air brushing against his face as he looked out over the kingdom he had once ruled with an iron fist, now thriving under his and Evie's leadership. The land stretched out before him, fertile fields, bustling towns, and a city that had once been the heart of a ruthless empire, now vibrant with life and promise. The lycanthropes, once rulers by birthright, were now just as bound to the kingdom as the mortals they had once looked down upon. The kingdom was healing, and with every passing day, the bond between mortals and lichens grew stronger. But it hadn't been easy. There were still challenges ahead, remnants of the old ways that would take time to erase. Yet, as Asher stood with Evie at his side, he knew that they had already accomplished something incredible. They had built a world where both lichens and mortals could live side by side, where power was no longer wielded through fear but earned through trust and respect. Their union, the blood pact that had once bound them together, had become a symbol of the change they had brought to the kingdom. The bond between them had only grown stronger as the years passed, and with it, the kingdom flourished. It was a legacy that neither of them had ever anticipated, but one that they had worked tirelessly to create. Asher turned to Evie, who stood beside him, her silver eyes reflecting the moonlight. She was no longer just the servant he had once known, no longer the mortal woman who had caught his eye in the darkness of the old kingdom. She had become something more. His partner, his queen, the embodiment of the change they had brought to the world. Together, they had reshaped the kingdom, tearing down the walls that had once divided the races and building something new in their place. Mortals were no longer subjugated, no longer treated as lesser beings. They had a voice now, a place in the kingdom, and Asher could see the difference it made in their lives. The lycanthropes, too, had adapted, shedding the weight of their old ways and embracing a future where equality wasn't just an ideal but a reality. "We've come so far," Evie said, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "But there's still so much to do." Asher nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "I know. There will always be challenges ahead, but we've built something that can last, a kingdom that isn't ruled by power or fear, but by trust." They stood there together, side by side, the future of the kingdom resting in their hands. Asher had never imagined that one day he would be standing here, with Evie, looking out at the world they had created. He had once sought power for its own sake, but now he understood that true power lay not in the throne, but in the unity of those who ruled together, mortals and lichens alike. They were no longer defined by their differences, but by their shared hope for a better world. But just as Asher began to feel the weight of the future settling into place, a distant shadow fell over their peaceful kingdom. A storm was coming, a final threat from outside the kingdom, one that sought to destroy the new order they had worked so hard to create. Asher had always known that peace was never guaranteed. No matter how much they had accomplished, no matter how much they had changed, there would always be those who sought to destroy what they had built. Asher had led his people through one battle after another, but this new threat was different. This enemy came from beyond the borders of their kingdom, and they sought to topple everything that Asher and Evie had worked for. The news came swiftly. A messenger arrived at the castle with word of a gathering force, an army that threatened to invade and destroy the fragile peace Asher and Evie had built. The lycanthropes, powerful and proud, were being challenged once again. This time, it wasn't just a matter of reclaiming the throne. It was a matter of protecting everything they had built, everything they had fought for. "We can't let this happen," Asher said, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the situation. He stood in the war room, surrounded by his closest allies, including Evie, who stood beside him, her presence unwavering. "This kingdom is ours to protect. We won't let anyone destroy it." Evie's eyes met his, and she nodded. "We've fought for this. We've rebuilt it. And we won't lose it now." The army they faced was formidable, an alliance of enemies from outside the kingdom who sought to exploit the weaknesses in the new order. But Asher and Evie had learned to fight together, to trust in each other's strength. And now, as the enemy's forces approached, they would stand united, just as they always had. The final battle would be fierce, and the outcome uncertain, but Asher and Evie had faced the darkness together before, and they would do so again. This time, they weren't just fighting for the throne, they were fighting for the future. The battle raged on, but Asher and Evie were unyielding. The forces of the enemy were strong, but they were no match for the power that flowed between the two of them. Together, they fought with an intensity that matched the storm raging outside. Asher's claws slashed through the air, tearing through their enemies with precision, while Evie fought at his side, her powers amplifying with every moment, the lycanthrope blood within her a force to be reckoned with. The kingdom stood on the precipice, and Asher and Evie would stand together at the edge, ready to face whatever came next. They had built something worth protecting, something that transcended power, fear, and domination, and now they would protect it with everything they had. As the battle raged, the legacy of the Wolf King was no longer defined by his rule. It was defined by the strength of the bond he shared with Evie, by the kingdom they had built together, and by the future they would fight to protect. Together, they would walk into the future, bound by love, loyalty, and a shared destiny. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Asher and Evie would face them together. The storm was far from over, but they had already won the most important battle, the battle for the future. And that was a legacy that could never be undone.